discussion on essentially saying that, hey, can we come up with a predictive analytics? I think the timing was not so great because the moment we said predictive analytics, COVID hit. And given the fact that the pharmaceutical supply chain is anyway complex, I think it just made our job a little bit more harder. So as Andrea was saying, and as the slide kind of depicts, pharmaceutical supply chain is an extremely complex, it operates in an extremely complex environment. Number one, it's global. So different pieces that go into drug and even the packaging and the bottles and you name it, they all come from different parts of the world. And then the second piece is it's a very highly regulated industry, but because it's global, the regulations are not consistent, right? Some of them, in some places, they're more regulated versus the other. And then they go through so many different points that, from the place where you pick up the raw materials all the way till it gets to the hands of the patients, there are so many points where easily those disruptions can take place. The manufacturing itself is not that easy. That's pretty complex because, as you all know, it's drugs that go into your body and it helps you maintain a healthy lifestyle. So obviously, the conditions under which these drugs are manufactured are extremely important and they're extremely complex. The best part that I think the Express Scripts team would like to take credit for is that the things that came into or that were highlighted during the pandemic is something that we actually identified and understood the potential for disruption way before the pandemic hit. And that is one of the reasons why we were able to mitigate our supply disruptions quite a bit. So moving along, into the next slide. So we talked about the environment in which the pharmaceutical and manufacturing or the supply chain operates being complex. The complexity actually is increased by all the different members or tiers of supply chain that impact the industry itself. So the supply chain needs to be coordinated between very different stakeholders who necessarily are not always on the same page, not even in the same country, and not on the same manufacturing schedule. So things like, the manufacturers, of course, are key, but then, we have suppliers of raw materials, we have logistics people, we have regulations, regulatory agencies, we have governments, and then on the end customer side, we have the wholesalers and distributors, we have the pharmacies. So a lot of stakeholders are involved before the drug can actually get to the hands of the patient. So during COVID, a lot of these, a lot of the inconsistencies and the fact that not all of them were on the same page were just exaggerated to quite a bit. And, we went into a little bit of uncharted territories. But again, as I said, we had, from an Express Scripts perspective, we had identified a lot of these elements. I think the key here, and Andrea would walk you through that, is the fact that the way that all these different elements interacted with each other, those were the ones that were very different during the pandemic. Versus what it would have been in the normal times. So Andrea, I want to turn that back to you.
Thank you, Jaya. So with this...
Let's get your microphone on so that online people can hear you.
Keep going. Okay, so with this setup, the research needs and motivation behind why ESI had started looking at data to predict the risks, anticipate disruptions, is just that it's a really important problem. As and even as Mitch was saying, we want to have our prescriptions, and we need them for our health and well-being. So even Congress has passed, it has been proposing to mandate some risk assessments for the industry, because it really is a security issue, it's a wellness issue, and within the CARES Act, there were funds even aimed to mitigate and prevent future medical product shortages. Currently, or prior to this project, ESI did have a risk assessment model that involved weighted risk scoring. Now, Jaya, do you want to take it back, or should I keep going? Because I know the back and forth can be difficult.
Yeah, no, keep going, Andrea.
Okay. Where each risk factor, and these are variables that we are looking at for the relationship with the disruptions, or the impact of the disruption, is evaluated by assigning a risk score. And each factor has a weight. And at the end of the day, you end up with a weighted score that is going to represent both the likelihood and the impact of a disruption for a given product. The impact of the product. The improvement of our approach is adding predictive capability to the existing model, in that we are looking at coming up with an actual probability for what's the probability that this product will have a disruption? What's the probability that this vendor will have a disruption within the next X time frame? And when you get into the level of probabilities, you can be more precise in some of your mitigation strategies. So our approach within the risk assessment, there is both descriptive and predictive analytics. Of course, they have to go together. It is worth mentioning that for the data, there are product or drug level risk factors, there's vendor level risk factors, and then there's also order data as well. And within this presentation, I will focus on the vendor model, so predicting which vendor will have a disruption, and also the product model of which product will have a disruption. I'm going to skip past this. There is a lot of data cleaning to go from the original data down to the models, but it all fits together again in what I've mentioned with the 3 data sets. We were able to distill from the order data a number of variables that were related to disruptions. Some of them, for example, the number of orders, you see the bars are showing this pattern, but there's a smaller difference between them. Some of them, there's a big gap between the frequency of disruption or the rates of disruption for the different variables. On the drug level, the price became an important variable, and the variability in the lead time was also indicative of disruptions. So before I move on to the next slide, this is going to feel a little bit like class, but I want to put up a little confusion matrix to define. We're going to be talking about recall, precision, false alarms. There are all different ways to measure the performance of the prediction. So one, how many of those actual disruptions are you finding? And among your alarms that you are raising and saying, okay, this is at risk, how many of those are actually going to be a disruption, and how many false alarms are you going to be raising? And one of the things that I think we all know from life is you can't have your cake and eat it too. There are lots of trade-offs involved no matter what you do. So depending on how we set the cutoff for defining, and this is for just defining high risk and low risk, the higher the cutoff, of course, you are going to be losing some of those disruptions, but you're going to do better in, say, your false alarm rate. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to find a balance among these different measures. But we were fitting the model. We were doing great. We had our 2018 trading data, then we were validating with 2019. So looking into the future, and we're getting similar performance. Of course, it degrades a little bit from the training to the validation, but getting great results. Our comparison to the risk factors were looking great as well. And as I mentioned when introducing the risk factors, those are intended to measure not just the likelihood, but also the impact. So it's a little bit of an unfair comparison. But in evaluating, I mean, we're looking at the rates of disruptions given a low, moderate, or high risk score. And so we're getting really good results. relative to the prior method if the goal is to predict the likelihood or probability of a disruption. And then the COVID-19 pandemic began. And Jai, do you want to talk a little bit about what it was like when the COVID-19 pandemic hit?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Andrew was saying, the COVID-19, of course, did impact almost every industry. So pharmaceuticals was not an exception. So some of the things, the biggest impacts of the COVID-19 that had on the pharmaceutical industry was, number one, there was the logistics constraints, right? So there were not enough people to move the products from one port to the other. So definitely there was a significant constraints in terms of the carrier and container and local transportation availability. The second thing was absenteeism. So as the pandemic started hitting different parts of the world, the people who are actually working in those factories were also impacted. So which definitely lowered the capacity of the manufacturing. The third thing was all the different restrictions, right? So the country started closing the borders, which meant that the movement of raw materials and finished products became a huge issue. And last but not the least, it's also a surge in demand. So I know, I think it was two presentations before when the presenter was talking about the behavioral approaches to what happened when the COVID pandemic began. So think about, if you have a run on the toilet paper, here we are talking about drugs. And, people were definitely wanting to stockpile them. And of course, there were all these different, social media and mass media impact on saying, well, this drug works really well for COVID and that drug will work for COVID. And of course, some of the runs on those drugs. So all those different elements were all were the ones that were actually impacting significantly the pharmaceutical industry. From a Express Scripts perspective, because we had this risk management program in place, one of the biggest benefits that we had were that we had all this information come through much more faster and much more earlier than the rest of the industry. So we were monitoring all these impact as the COVID rolled through the world, and we were rolling with them. And we were able to quickly put in or implement our risk mitigation strategy, as I said, working with because we had set this SOPs in place long before COVID. COVID, of course, accelerated, and we were doing that at a much more higher and more faster pace, but still that tremendously helped us. The coordination between all the different teams from sourcing all the way to the pharmacies to mitigate that was something that we were able to do. But again, that is definitely from a risk mitigation perspective, we were very successful. But from a predictive modeling perspective, of course, that did change the way that change, especially the impact, right? And the likelihood of happening, the weights and the probabilities that were assigned to those risk elements did change significantly, which impacted our predictive, the way our predictive modeling results were impacted. So Andrea, back to you.
On the one hand, on the one hand, it makes the prediction really hard, but on the other hand, it provides a nice opportunity to collect data. So here we are looking on the left where there's a lower variance, everything's more close together. This is the distribution of the difference in mean so the average score for some of these variables from 2018 to 2019. And then if you look at 2019 to 2020, suddenly it's much more spread out. So there are a lot more changes just among the variables and their values themselves, their measures. And we can also run some hypothesis testing to look at what is the consistency of the relationship of each of our risk factors with disruptions. And under normal times, pre-pandemic, 2018 to 2019, a majority of the variables And I've worded it as not inconsistent, because technically we either reject or do not reject the null hypothesis. So technically I can't say stable, technically it's not inconsistent. But that's what we would want to see if we're making predictions. At least it's not inconsistent. Then you fast forward, and only among those that were at least not inconsistent pre-pandemic, well, let's look at how they do 2019 to 2020, and now it's flipped. And I think actually the last one that's pure orange, that should be pure blue. So forgive my color mix up on that slide, but suddenly everything is moving, is changing, and making it a much harder problem. The insight to draw here, though, is that model updating on a regular basis is incredibly important, tracking the data, tracking the changes. If we look at changes in our vendor model and our product model performance without updates, notice everything is going down from Q2, Q3, Q4, and that is a measure of the effect of not updating, especially in a really dynamic environment like the pandemic. So if I had to send you home with one take-home message, data is important for prediction, but it changes all the time. So you have to stay on top of those changes with model updates. Thank you, everyone, and I will open it up for questions. Yes.
Now, question for Gary. Now, if you could a favor, use the microphone so everybody online can hear your question without repeating.
Now that you've developed this experience and understand the impact of COVID, what would Jaya do differently the next time COVID was about to hit or hits?
Jaya?
Absolutely. So, definitely. So we have understood, hey, where those fault lines lie, and we have already updated our models, and we're also, updating our risk mitigation strategies, right? So so those are the two big things that we have already done. And hopefully, I'm hoping that we don't get another COVID, but if it does, then we are definitely prepared to the best of our knowledge. But the thing about the risk is that we cannot eliminate it, right? We can only mitigate it. We don't know what we don't know, but I think based on what we have learned through this COVID, we have definitely shored up our risk models, and we will see what the future brings, and then we will we're very flexible. So we built our models in such a way that, hey, if as and when the situation changes, it is again, very, very dynamic, as Andrea had pointed out on the slide. So our models need to be dynamic. It cannot be static, and our models are built that way, and our mitigation strategies are built that way. So we have made those appropriate changes, but again, we are ready to, our model and our team is ready to flex and change based on what the next big thing happens, which we always want not to happen.
Hi, my question's how is the data and what we've learned from what you've learned currently impacting how you partner with your vendors? How is that changing maybe the old way you did things versus how you're looking at the future?
Is that a question for me? I hope it is. That is actually a great question. So I think earlier on, the relationship, the vendors, the data, so we do depend on the vendors to provide us a lot of the data, which they consider extremely confidential and proprietary. So one of the things that I think was a benefit that came out of this COVID, or the silver lining that came out of COVID, was this change in the dynamic between us and our suppliers, who realized, hey, working in more closer partnership with us actually benefits not just us, but them too. So there's a lot of mutual benefit that was really clearly laid out during this COVID. So so we are working with our vendors to say, hey, can you, how can we share a little bit more data between both of us? Are there other areas, like, for example, specifically with respect to logistics, with respect to what we call the key starting materials, way up the supply chain, for which we didn't have much visibility, but which had a huge impact on the manufacturing capacity during this COVID. So we are starting to have more open discussions. The manufacturers are more willing to talk about and share about those types of information that were not necessarily they were willing to do so before. Definitely that has changed for the positive. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank